Thank you for inviting me to be part of this conference. My presentation today is titled An Intersectional Pathway Penalty: Income Trajectories of Filipina Immigrant Women Inside and Outside Canada's Live-In Caregiver Program. And this is based on a paper published with my colleagues Rupa Banerjee, Ethel Tungohan, Connolly de Leon, and Philip Kelly. So by way of introduction, I'll begin by noting that the Philippines, in particular, is now regularly among the top source countries for new immigrants arriving to Canada. And notably, women represent a significantly larger proportion of immigrants from the Philippines, at close to 60%, than other immigrant groups in Canada. Yet despite this, there is a paucity of large-scale and longitudinal quantitative analyses of Filipina immigrants' multifaceted experiences in the labor market. So this is one of the main gaps that our paper aims to fill. Our two research questions are as follows. First, we ask, in what ways does Canada's gendered, racialized, and classed immigration system structure migration pathways? And how do these migration pathways in turn affect post-migration integration as measured by employment income over time? Our second question asks, do Filipino women as a feminized and racialized immigrant labor force in Canada have distinctive labor market trajectories as compared to women from other source countries and across various immigration entry streams? So given the focus of this conference, I'm not going to spend much time on the background or theory, and I'm really going to focus on our data, methods, and results. So this paper uses the Statistics Canada Longitudinal Immigration Database, or IMDb microdata. And for those of you who are perhaps less familiar with this data, the IMDb is notable because it combines administrative data from anonymized immigrant landing files with tax data files, which are collected on an annual basis. So the IMDb is a comprehensive source of data collected by government agencies on the socioeconomic outcomes of the tax filing immigrant population who landed in Canada beginning in 1980. And for this paper, our focus is specifically on a rolling sample of women of typical working age, so between 25 and 64, who immigrated to Canada between 1996 and 2016, who came either as principal applicants in the Foreign Skilled Worker Program category, as principal applicants in the Live-In Caregiver Program, or who came through the family class as spouses or common law partners. So we exclude refugees and dependent applicants in the FSWP and LCP entry classes. And this is due to their unique circumstances surrounding entry into the labor market, which makes their income trajectories distinct. And the resultant population for analysis that we have is over 600,000 immigrant women. So we certainly have the benefit of a very large population or sample size here. Now, again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about our research design, but we do use longitudinal growth curve modeling here to examine the unique trajectories of individuals and groups in repeated measures data. So multi-level modeling permits the study of individual change in mean employment income over time in the Canadian labor market, which is our focus, as well as measurement of how changes differ with time across groups. And further, this modeling strategy accommodates the examination of how time-stable and time-varying factors both influence the outcomes. So just very briefly to look at the equations here, our first equation, or the level 1 or within-person model, estimates mean employment income as a nonlinear or quadratic function of the number of years since the respondent's first tax form submission in Canada. Our second equation, or equation 2, demonstrates that this intercept varies by person level, so time-stable characteristics, such as age at landing, number of work permits held prior to landing, and education level at landing. And finally, our third equation, or equation 3, models the slope for the time in the labor market and indicates the expected non-linear rate of change per year in the labor market, at the same time as W1I indicates that this rate of change is expected to vary across individuals. So I'll be happy to answer any further questions about our modeling strategy or research design during the Q&A period. So to really hone in on the development of our model, we have two main independent variables. Our first independent variable is looking at the entry class of the immigrant women. Again, comparing those that were principal applicants in the foreign skilled worker program to those that were principal applicants in the live-in caregiver program to those that were arrived as spouses or common law partners in the family class. And our second main independent variable is birth country. And here we compare women from the Philippines to women coming from all other countries. And this is because, of course, the Philippines is the dominant birth country of women coming through the caregiver class, which is our focus. Our main dependent variable here is mean monthly employment income, or MEI, for each year. And we adjust this for inflation to constant 2016 dollars, so we can compare across years. And those reporting zero employment income in a particular year are removed from the analysis for that year, but they remain in the analysis for the other years in which non-zero income is reported. And this is another benefit of using longitudinal growth curve modeling. Now, in terms of the control variables that we include in the model, we use a variety of time-stable controls which are selected from the landing file data. And these include age at landing, education at landing, self-reported official language fluency, year of landing, which addresses cohort effects, skill level at landing, and we have clerical or intermediate as the reference category there because that's the main skill level for women coming through the live-in caregiver program, and number of work permits held prior to landing. Now, at the same time, our models also incorporate several time-varying controls. So these are selected from the annual tax file data and are able to vary for each year of data collection. And these include age, marital status, number and age of children, whether the person reported self-employment income that year, whether they claimed a tuition credit that year, which we use as a proxy for being enrolled in schooling, and their location or city of settlement. And we also include dummy variables for each year of labor market income and continuous variables for time since arrival in Canada, which is measured based on the individual's first tax year, which is prior to landing for immigrants who hold a work permit before attaining permanent resident status, as well as its square, to examine interactions with time and to address the nonlinear relationship between mean monthly employment income and length of time in the labor market for immigrant women. So finally, we get to some results. And the first here is simply looking at descriptively the mean monthly employment income by year for our three entry classes of comparison. And here, our data show that foreign skilled worker program women, so that's the blue bars, have the highest MEI for each year of analysis, with the gap actually increasing over time. So for just under half of the years, LCP women, so that's the red bar, on average, have a marginally higher mean monthly employment income than family class women. There's really no consistent trend when we compare those red and yellow bars. In total, we see that over the 20-year time frame, foreign skilled worker program women have MEI that is 49% higher on average than live-in caregiver program women and 53% higher on average than family class women. And we also note that across entry classes, female immigrants have employment income that is often well below the national average, and in some cases is close to the poverty line. So next we move on to the results of our growth curve models. And this allows us to examine more closely the relationship between entry class, birth country, and individual economic outcomes. And of particular interest to us is how processes of gendering or racializing combine with immigration policy to impact upward or downward income trajectories over and above what we would expect given each group's distinctive human capital. So of course, the results from these models control for human capital and various other individual characteristics. So this figure compares the MEI, or mean monthly employment income, of LCP immigrants to equivalent female immigrants in the other two comparative entry classes. And here there's really three key findings. First, we see that LCP immigrants, again with the red line, have far lower income trajectories than comparable foreign skilled worker program and family class immigrant women. And this is both true upon landing and over time in the labor market, whereupon we see that the gap actually widens. So we see concrete evidence of the devaluation of feminized care work, what is often called a care penalty. Second of all, we see that while foreign skilled worker program and family class immigrants, so the blue and yellow lines, make similar income upon entering the labor market, over time, we see that a gap emerges, with the foreign skilled worker program women making substantively more by the end of our time frame. So here again, we're seeing how entry class has an ongoing and independent effect on women's earnings. And this is net of personal characteristics and human capital, with family class immigrants, who are also called tide movers, experiencing an income penalty. And the third takeaway here is that live-in caregiver program caregivers are not permitted to take educational courses longer than 6 months during their mandated in-home work permit. And this limits their ability to upgrade their skills or retrain while in the program. So this is a third thing we suggest potentially helps to explain their ongoing downward mobility in the labor market relative to women in the other entry classes. And finally, I just note that the nonlinear trajectories that we see here, as well as in the next figure, reinforce prior findings, suggesting that there's an initial increase in earnings over time in the labor market that either diminishes or reverses over the longer term. And this is likely due in part to aging and the associated number of hours in the labor market, which we cannot measure, unfortunately, in the IMDb, and or to age discrimination and de-skilling processes over time. So the results I have here, the final figure we'll be looking at today, look at growth curve models comparing Filipina, so narrowing in on birth country, to non-Filipino women across all three entry classes. And here it is demonstrated that non-Filipina foreign skilled worker program women do by far the best over time. So that's the blue line with the circles. And comparatively, we see that LCP workers, so the two red lines, fare the worst. And this is true for both Filipina and non-Filipino women. But we also see that Filipinas have a consistent advantage. So they do better within the lower paid LCP entry class. So that's the red squares versus the red circles. But however, we see the reverse trend within the foreign skilled worker program and family class entry classes. While in the highly paid foreign skilled worker program class or higher paid, Filipino women do start off faring better than non-Filipinas. This advantage disappears and substantially reverses over time. So we see that in higher earning entry classes, being Filipina is, especially over time, a disadvantage. In the lower earning live-in caregiver program class, being Filipina is an advantage. So this is perhaps an intriguing finding and may speak to the ways that Filipina identity is racialized in the Canadian labor market as constituting a superior workforce in low-paid jobs that are constructed as quote-unquote low-skilled, but are thought to be less suited to the higher strata of the workforce, where different kinds of cultural capital and social networks are valorized. So what do we take away from these findings? Certainly, the data reinforce suggestions that immigration policies shape labor market outcomes in Canada, with intersectional effects that lead to ongoing stratification along gender, class, and racial lines. So we see that processes of differentiation tied to gender, race, and immigration pathway result in distinct labor market trajectories for women in the LCP and for Filipino women in particular. And second, we suggest that the results of this study foreground the intersectional pathway penalty that exists for immigrant women in Canada, whereby race intersects with immigration pathways and labor market policies to shape women's economic outcomes. So entry class in particular is found to have substantive and ongoing effects on labor market income for immigrant women, even when we control for work experience prior to achieving permanent residency in Canada, human capital, and personal and family characteristics. So thank you very much for your time and attention, and I'm certainly happy to answer any questions that you may have during the Q&A period.
Thank you for coming to this talk. I'll start by sharing my screen. Okay, so as the title suggests, this paper looks at the Canadian Labour Force Survey from a researcher's perspective. There's a long tradition of such papers south of the border, particularly on new or complex American data sets. The LFS may not be new, but it is long running and it's gone through changes over the years. And being a labor force survey, its structure is more complex than other surveys. So I think there is value in this exercise. For those that are interested in more detail, this talk is based on a paper of the same name published in the Canadian Public Policy this fall. Okay, so the contribution of the papers are twofold. The first one is I provide a unified source of information on the LFS. Given that researchers often use multiple decades of LFS data, I think it's important to know how it's evolved over time. It's important to understand the structure of the LFS and its implication for research. So I'll be talking about the construction of mini panels in this talk, for example. I want to compare and contrast the public use and master file versions of the LFS. And given the costs associated with accessing the master files in terms of opportunity cost of your time, because you have to do the research in the RDCs, it's important to have a clear understanding of subtle and not so subtle differences between the two versions. So the structure of the talk is I start by an overview of the LFS. I discuss the evolution of the LFS, the researcher's perspective. I do a comparison of public use versus master file. And I give applications of my own research where I use a master file. What richness did I use? Okay. So what is the LFS? A quick description of it. Since its inception as a quarterly survey in November 45, and subsequently as a monthly survey 52 onwards, the LFS has been gathering labor market information on Canadian households. As of the 60s, it became the official source of labor statistics. And I'd argue that these statistics are barometers of labor market activity in Canada. And in fact, these statistics have a direct bearing on the generosity of labor market programs, such as the EI program. Okay, so a couple of details about the LFS, the population of interest, individuals 15 and up, who live in Canada, are not institutionalized, who are not full-time members of the armed forces, and individuals living on reserve and in very remote areas are also excluded from the survey. So then the question is, why are Indigenous people of Indigenous background that are living on reserve are not asked to survey, whereas if you live off reserve, you are? That's beyond the scope of this talk, but I do talk about it in my paper. It's a little teaser for you, so that you can read it. In terms of sample size, quite large. We're talking about 50,000 households per month, some variation over the years, like during COVID time, a little bit smaller, but we're talking about roughly 100,000 people a month. Okay. What are some of the key strengths? I'm going to give you 3 of them. The one that's most widely known is it provides researchers with rich labor market information spanning multiple decades. So that way it allows researchers to better understand the working of the labor market and how it's evolved over time. So people have looked at labor market outcomes, and I give some of the outcomes people have looked in the associated papers. Some people have looked at, tried to measure how these labor market policy affect the economy. So whether it's disability insurance, minimum wage, I've done a paper on that, universal child care, employment insurance. Okay. A second key feature of the LFS is its high frequency of the data. It's monthly. And this is the part people don't know as much, is this tight production deadline, less than 1 month from enumeration to its public release. And that makes the LFS a timely source of data. And we found this during COVID time. There's a very, very large literature on the impact of COVID-19 on the economy. And a lot of these papers rely on the LFS. And here are some examples of some. A third feature of it is one can take advantage of the fact that it's conducted as a series of rolling panels. So a household remains in a survey for 6 consecutive months, and you can use that to construct mini panels. So what's the idea? You'll have 1/6 of the sample enter in January. They're interviewed in January, February, March, April, May, June. And then in July, a new household is interviewed. Well, in February, then you have a 1/6 of the sample is replaced, and people are there from February to July and so on. So it makes it possible to construct mini panels, but this can only be done with the master files. But anyway, these are some examples of papers that have looked at it. One key feature is a lot of times it's the same researchers that have relied on these master files. Part of it is people didn't know how to do it. And in this paper, I do talk about what variables you knew, what are the strength of using the master files for mini panels and such. Okay. So the evolution of the LFS, what do we know? As with other long-running surveys, it's gone through regular updates, typically right at post-census. Some of the key changes, education, the focus changed from years of education to educational attainment in 1990. We had a new questionnaire in 96, 97. Talk about new content, information on wage, more information, hours work, information on union membership, job permanency, size of employing establishment. And also, which a lot of people don't realize, is there's also an enriched set of potential responses. And this was done in part to better account for the role of family responsibilities. Finally, another important change is there's regular updates of industry and occupation classification. So this public use versus master file issue, there's this trade-off that statistical agencies face, or a dilemma, providing more detailed information that researchers need while still protecting the confidentiality of respondents. So as a result, many statistical agencies like StatsCan provide 2 versions of the same data set, and that's true of the LFS. A public use file version that's readily available, whose data is being modified, and a master file that provides more detail where access is restricted. And it's restricted, as you know, is you have to go to the RDC to access the confidential use files. There's an important caveat that I do want to mention when people think about this idea of whether I should use public use files or master file. StatsCan or any statistical agencies, they have to account for the risk of residual disclosure that is associated with the comparison of different versions of the same public use data. So if you make changes and you go back in time, then people could possibly compare the 2 data sets and may be able to decipher some stuff that they should not. So as a result, the public use files, if they make changes, it's just moving forward. Whereas the master files, they can make changes going back in time. So it's very important. This is one important limitation of the public use files is a lot of time, there's a lot of time inconsistencies across the years because they've changed how they do stuff. Or some variables were added, they're just added as of this period on, but then other variables are removed. Okay, so some of the modifications to the public use files. The biggest one is suppression of information, which includes, among others, the variables used to follow individuals across time are not there in the public use files, and also the variables that can tie you to other individuals in the survey who belongs to the same household is not there. You also don't know what rotation the individual's in the public use file. Did the person just enter? So for example, just entered in January, or is it somebody that's in their 6th month? Why is that important? Some variables are not refreshed. So for example, if you stay with the same employer over the 6th month, they ask you that information, your wage in the 1st month. But then if you're with the same employer, they're not going to ask you the same question later. So you don't know who was refreshed and who was not. Okay. And obviously there's other pieces of information that are not there in the public use file, Indigenous identity and ethnicity. They'll collapse response to categories, age, 5 years, geography, course or group, occupation, industry. There is some top coding, but not much. Okay, so now what do I want to do? I want to talk about some of my research, my own research. I've used the master files. What have I done? Why is the master file so rich and such a good data to use? I've used it now. It's now my 9th project. So I truly believe in this data set. So this is a paper co-authored with Jonathan Crachet. It should say 2021. And what we look at is survey non-response in COVID time, the case of the labor force survey. Some motivation. The COVID-19 has had a tremendous and pervasive disruption of economic activities. And what we do know is statistical agencies were not spared. Their collection activities were severely constrained. And as a result, non-response rates have surged. And this is true of all surveys. Okay, so I'll come back in a sec. Yet a substantial body of work analyzing the economic impact of COVID-19 is based on survey data. Here's some example. So what we decided to do is we want to explore how the COVID-19 disruption impacted the Canadian labor force survey. Now, a disclaimer ahead of time. My experience with the labor force survey has always been that it is viewed as a flagship survey and the data quality is very strong, which explains why I've used it 9 times. Now, survey non-response did increase in the LFS, and they went from slightly above 10, 11, or 12 to the mid-20s and to the high 20s, the non-response rate. This may sound very large, but compared to other surveys, it is still a very good non-response rate. And I would argue that if you had a non-response rate in the mid to late 20s% pre-COVID, for most surveys, this would have been considered beautiful. So we have to be careful. As yes, we want to look at because it's a widely used survey, but going into our expectation was the data quality would still hold. It would still be a reliable source, but it's still important to dig in there because, for example, if you use the panels, are the problems amplified? So these are issues we want to look at. Okay, so what are the key features of the master files we use? The mini panels, the factor rotation, are you new or not? And the imputation flag, the variable that identifies if your record was fully imputed. So what are some of the key findings we have? We can trace the information about the type of non-response allows us to trace back the increase in non-response to the suspension of in-person interviews, which have historically played a key role in establishing contact. So when COVID hit, they suspended all in-person interviews. So this is where we trace it back to why non-response rate increased. Most of the increase can be accounted by birth non-response. So the failure to establish initial contact in a sample rather than subsequent non-response, the failure to collect current information on individuals who've already been reached in the prior month. Why is this important? We talk about it in our paper, But that means that this is very important to research and very comforting. It means that we don't expect additional difficulties using panels compared to cross-section or when using public use versus restricted use files. Some other key findings. We do find that individuals with vulnerabilities to COVID-19 economic shock, the young, low educated, low salary, low job tenure, those working in occupation with low telework potential have been harder to reach and less represented in there. So what do? We use exogenous variation assignment of individual to different rotation. We present evidence suggesting that the decline in employment and labor force participation being underestimated over the March-July 2020 period. We believe, however, that these non-response biases have been moderate compared when contrasted with the unprecedented severity of the COVID disruption. And again, for us, it links back to, yes, non-response rate did increase, but it is a level still that would be envious of a lot of other surveys. So all in all, we believe the LFS remains a reliable data source for analyzing the economic impact of COVID-19 in a timely manner. A second paper it's a paper with, again, Jonathan Cachet and now with Brian Deng, is looking at labor market flows and trajectories. The massive job loss through the shutdown of the early phase of the outbreak were followed by a rigorous rebound upon the gradual reopening of the economy. And now, as was the case for many countries. To give you an idea, there was an initial drop of 3 million, and by July, it had recovered, but we're still talking about July 2020, still talking $1.3 million below pre-COVID level. So this unusual trajectory is being extensively analyzed, starting with papers like Lemieux, Jones, etc. But the focus is mainly being in net terms. But I think it's important to understand the flows, who's been leaving, who's been coming back. So what's the contribution of this paper? So we used the confidential use files of the labor force survey to study the dynamics of employment in Canada from the early onset of COVID-19 to midsummer. So what are the key features we use? It's the mini panels. We want to understand if people were in a certain state of the world in 1 month, where are they afterwards? So 3 factors appear to be key in accounting for the incomplete employment recovery. Unusually high separation flows that characterize the labor market in the reopening phase, low reemployment probability of recent job losers who were classified as out of the labor force during the lockdown, and a low job finding rate of individuals who were out of work prior to the pandemic. Also, our results further suggest that the gross job loss were higher among women and young workers in the shutdown, and that older workers were more likely to leave the labor force when the economy reopened. So I'm going to wrap up now this talk with I'll mention one last paper, and I'll be fairly quick about it. It's a paper with Till Gross and Chris Borswick. It's a paper published in the CJE. It's called Temporary Foreign Workers and Firms, Theory and Canadian Evidence. Motivation. Faced with complaints of worker skills shortages, many countries turned to temporary foreign workers to supply domestic firms with the needed labor services. While a negative correlation between unemployment and TFWs, while we see that, the large rise in unemployment during the Great Recession did not lead to decline in TFWs, temporary foreign workers. So it casts doubt on this issue of temporary skill shortages. So what does our paper do? We propose a simple efficiency wage model that tries to understand why firms would want to hire temporary foreign workers. And for this talk, we examine the empirical evidence for this model. So the key features of master files is the mini panel and the rich labor market information. So what are the key findings? We find that consistent with this our efficiency wage model that temporary foreign workers, because of a lower outside option, would offer more effort compared to domestic workers. We find evidence that they work longer hours, lower rate absenteeism, and less likely to be laid off. So there is where we use the richness of the master file is conditional working was probably being laid off in the subsequent month. And moreover, for TFWs, from home countries, a relatively high outside option, effort is lower than TFWs from other countries. So thank you very much for attending this presentation. And if you're interested in the paper, this is the information for where it's cited.
Hi. Today I will talk about some of the changes that the Canadian EI program experienced over the last 15 years and whether and how these changes impacted the employment outcomes of displaced workers following a job loss. This is based on work I've done with Brian McCall, who will be attending the live session. The objective of today's presentation is to summarize what we learned from the recent past on how increasing the generosity of EI can help better support return to work and inform the current discussion on modernizing the EI program following the pandemic. According to the latest Statistics Canada job report for the month of July, 68.8% of the long-term unemployed have been unemployed for more than a year. This is the highest proportion on record since the data series started in 1976. The EI program's main objective has been to maintain a balance between, on the one hand, ensuring sufficient income benefits for the unemployed individuals, and on the other hand, encouraging workforce attachment in order to ensure a permanent return to work. How many or any of these changes to the EI program affect this balance is of great importance to both the EI users and the policymakers. And over the past 15 years, the Canadian government, well, specifically ESDC, has experimented with the changes to the EI program, and these experiments took the form of pilot programs. And the two pilot programs that we studied are the ones related to extending the duration of the benefit period and to increasing the earnings threshold before which the benefits are reduced when working while on claim. So if you see here in the middle column, the extended weeks benefit pilot increased the EI benefit duration up to 5 weeks to a maximum of 45 weeks. The first pilot was initiated in June 2004 and extended until February 2009 in a subset of economic regions, 21 of them, after which the extended benefit feature applied to all EI regions, and this was part of the Economic Action Plan following the start of the financial crisis in Canada. And the rationale at the time for the extended weeks pilot was based on research showing that a segment of the seasonal claimant population experienced gaps in income. They're referred to as seasonal gappers, and during which they do not receive EI benefits or employment income. And it turned out to be later found that seasonal workers are not unique in their difficulties in establishing a regular stream of income, and the pilot also benefited non-seasonal workers. The column on the far right is for the working while on claim pilot, which changed the allowable earnings formula for EI recipients in December 2005 in the same 21 economic region as the extended weeks pilot. This particular pilot project increased the level of allowable earnings from employment during a claim from a maximum of $50 or 25% of the benefit amount to a maximum of $75 or 40% of the benefit amount. And such a change gives unemployed workers increased incentive to work while on claim by taking a part-time job or a casual job, while still keeping a portion of their EI benefits. And by doing so, the unemployed workers are more likely to maintain their skills and workforce networks, and they can demonstrate that they're committed to work to their prospective employers. These rules are meant to help unemployed Canadians keep a foothold in the labor market and provide a stepping stone to permanent employment. So what we studied is based and focused on the 2004 to 2008 time period when it was possible to compare post-unemployment outcomes from individuals or households in a subset of regions, the pilot regions, and compare it to those in the control regions, those regions that didn't experience any changes. And we studied several post-unemployment outcomes related to transition back to full-time or part-time or temporary work, to job search efforts, and also whether the changes created any labor supply response following a spouse's job loss. And we are currently working on seeing if these changes also impacted occupational mobility and skill changes between the pre- and post-unemployment occupation. Because we focused on post-unemployment outcomes, we needed data which measure employment outcomes related to hours worked, occupation before and after an unemployment spell, and so on. And so we used the panel format of the labor force survey data and the SLID, the Survey of Labor and Income Dynamics, to obtain a representative sample of displaced workers and follow them prior to the job loss and after they're back in the labor force. And the SLID data has been discontinued after 2010, but for any current questions, now there are opportunities and increasing opportunities to create linkages in RDCs of administrative data, tax data, claims data, and link them with survey data to be able to continue studying these questions. So what we found is consistent with the literature in the US and Europe. The extension of EI benefit weeks in Canada created adverse employment effects, but these effects were tempered by the Working While on Claim program that incentivized the take-up of low hours and low earnings part-time jobs. We also found that increasing benefits duration is positively associated with increased job search effort and searching for a part-time job. There are some unintended consequences, however, of these benefit weeks extension is its impact on the labor supply of the spouse of the displaced worker. While we observe some upward adjustments on hours worked among the female spouse of displaced workers, reflecting an added worker effect in the short run, comparing with regions where EI-eligible unemployed individuals had access to the additional weeks of benefits from the pilot, we find that the extended weeks pilot inhibited the short-run added worker effect, crowding out the labor supply of married women. So given that the proportion of dual earner couples doubled in the last 40 years, this last result highlights the importance of taking into account the joint labor supply response of couples in the evaluation of policies designed to support individual decisions. More on the Working While on Claim pilot, we find that the results of the evaluation of the Working on Claim pilot based on the administrative claims data show that overall increasing the threshold of allowable employment earnings without any reduction in benefits and reducing the rate at which benefits are clawed back for earnings above the threshold, which was a change applied later on. Both changes successfully drew unemployed workers back into the labor force and encouraged them to work more. So EI claimants responded positively to these changes in Working While on Claim provisions. And we also can see that from this figure, shown in blue, the average number of weeks worked while on claim over time evolved. Despite the changes to the work provisions in a subset of regions in 2005, the overall use of the provisions did not change much in 2006 and 2007, but starting in 2008 and until 2012, the same provisions were extended to all regions, and you can see a substantial increase in average number of weeks worked while on claim starting in 2009. Note that the timing of these changes also coincided with an economic recession, with increased the number of people working on claim as a result. We see in the figure in the red line, the share of involuntary part-time work as a percentage of total part-time work grew from 19% in 2008 to 22.8% in 2009 during the last recession. And we also note that the during that same year, the number of regular claimants who used the Working While on Claim program increased by 29%. So certainly the program was well used during that recession. It's worth mentioning that half of all EI claimants choose not to work on claim, perhaps because they're not familiar with the program. They do not see part-time work as an attractive step toward permanent full-time employment. There can be barriers to the take-up of part-time work from a supply side as a result of skills depreciation or a lack of availability of short-hour part-time work from a demand side. Policymakers could test alternative working while on claim rules and consider more flexible parameters to engage claimants, such as converting weekly allowable earning thresholds into monthly or even yearly ones, much like the Canadian Recovery Benefit, the CRB. This would encourage them to take full-time jobs, even of short duration, as a possible bridge to permanent work. The parameters of the Working While on Claim program could be adjusted temporarily to be more generous during recessionary periods, as employers need to reduce the number of hours worked by their current workforce and hire new workers in part-time jobs. There is consistent evidence over time in the US and UK that part-time employment is counter-cyclical, going up during recessions and down during expansionary periods. And so we looked at whether that was the case in Canada as well. And you can see that on this graph here, that suggests that this is also the case. We use the LFS data, seasonally adjusted part-time and full-time. Part-time is in blue, and these employment series are in percentage deviation from their respective trends. So this series ends in 2019, and so the next question is, how do we see the same pattern going on with the pandemic or since the pandemic? And interestingly, that is not similar. We find that on the right, the graph shows the evolution of involuntary part-time share by month since the start of the lockdown restrictions in April 2020. This is in blue. And you see that the share increased significantly during the summer months after the first lockdown restrictions, and rapidly over the following overall 6 months. But by the time of the second wave and the lockdowns in late fall and throughout the winter that several provinces experienced, the share continuously just kept declining. And it's now back to the level of the pre-pandemic. So this is in stark contrast with the past financial recession, illustrated in the gray line, which shows the share having remained high in the following 2 years since the start of the recession. We also looked at the demographics of the long-term unemployed since the recession. We see on the left, it reveals that the pandemic-induced long-term unemployed tend to have greater job seniority, comparing the two darker gray columns of individuals who lost a job with more than 10 years of job seniority. The two dark blue column compare individuals with less than 6 months of job tenure. And so you can see across both recessions that the profile of long-term unemployed in terms of job tenure is quite different. On the right, we see that the distribution in terms of education also suggests that the pandemic-induced long-term unemployed in the black columns are as likely to be individuals with a high school degree as they are to hold higher post-secondary diploma. So to conclude, overall, our analysis of the EI changes prior to the pandemic confirms that extending the duration of benefits and making working while on claim more financially attractive had the intended combined effects of increasing job search efforts and increasing the take-up of part-time work while on claim. While there's no studies that has looked at the stepping stone effect of working part-time while on claim on finding a permanent full-time job in Canada, there is sufficient evidence from other countries like France and Belgium and Germany, who have more comprehensive data and similar working while on claim provisions, to suggest that it is the case, at least for certain groups of unemployed individuals with weaker labor force attachment to begin with, that working while on claim helps find a permanent job. Although the effects of the working while on claim provisions are generally positive, there needs to be more work done evaluating the working while on claim re-employment outcomes in the Canadian context, exploring further data linkages in the RDCs. This is particularly important following the pandemic and the fact that we just saw that the group of long-term unemployed is not only extremely large, but also quite diverse. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sebastian Bro. I want to welcome you to this session officially. I think we kind of went a little backwards here, jumping directly into the video presentations, but let me take a few minutes here to properly introduce our speakers, starting with the official welcome to this session on employment and income, which is part of our 2021 conference on research, recovery, and beyond. My name, by the way, is Sebastian Bro, so I will be the moderator for the Q&A session. I am an associate professor of economic geography at McGill University, where I'm also the academic director of the McGill Concordia RDC, which is part of the Quebec Inter-University Center for Social Statistics. I see that in the chat, some of you have put some questions. We would ask you to actually use the Q&A function in Zoom to list your questions so we can develop a proper queue. And also, while you're listing your question, please make sure to identify the speaker to which the question is addressed. Since we did launch immediately into the videos, we didn't have any time to present the speakers themselves. So let's take a few minutes to do so. We had three great speakers. Starting with our first presentation, which was from Naomi Lightman, who is Assistant Professor of Sociology at the University of Calgary. Dr. Lightman's research interests include migration, care work, gender inequality, and research methodology. She's currently a principal investigator on two SSHRC grants. The first one is an insight grant, which is titled Precarities and Disparities: Female Immigrant Care Workers over the Life Course, which examines how individual experiences and outcomes are shaped by key life events, structural forces, and intersecting identities. So this is part of the work that we heard from Dr. Lightman today. The second grant she's also engaged with in terms of a SSHRC, a partnership engaged grant, is titled Caring During COVID-19 Crisis: Immigrant Women Working in Long-Term Care in Calgary. So this project focuses specifically on the workplace impacts of the pandemic for immigrant women who are in personal support workers within long-term care institutions. Our second speaker second presentation was by Pierre Brochu, who is an associate professor in the economics department at the University of Ottawa. He received his BA and MA from the University of Toronto and his PhD from the University of British Columbia. His research interests are in labor economics and public policy. This includes exploring how labor market institutions, such as the temporary foreign worker program, the minimum wage, and unionization, impact labor market outcomes. He's also done research on job stability and job security, and some of his research work focuses on the topic of data quality. Many of his publications, as we heard again today, take advantage of the rotating panel design of the labor force survey to create mini panels that allow him to investigate important questions that cannot be answered using cross-sectional data by itself. Our third and final presentation was by Stéphanie Louise, who is a professor of economics at the University of Waterloo and also the director of the Southwestern RDC, which serves researchers at the University of Waterloo, Wilfrid Laurier University, and the University of Guelph. Prior to joining the University of Waterloo, Professor Louise completed her PhD in economics from the University of Montreal and worked at the University of Minnesota Industrial Relations Center. Her areas of specialization are labor and personnel economics, and she has published in the Journal of Labor Economics, Industrial and Labor Relations Review, and the Journal of Economic Behavior and Organizations, among others. Her latest policy-based research focuses on the impact of changes to the Canadian Employment Insurance Program on re-employment outcomes, skill changes, and spousal labor supply adjustments, as we heard briefly today, with her latest publications appearing in Canadian Public Policy. So again, I want to thank all three speakers for very interesting, rich presentations. And so we will now move into the Q&A session. I do see a few questions here, so keep submitting those in your Q&A function on Zoom. I would also invite the presenters to turn on their cameras so we can engage in that live discussion. There is, before I forget, one question that was submitted on the chat, which I noted down, and this one is addressed to you, Dr. Leichman, and it has to do with how entry class, the birth of country, gender efforts, how they affect labor market outcomes. And the question is specifically in terms of whether you could elaborate on the inclusion of class in the analysis itself.
Sure, great. And thank you for that important question. I think as Mohammed is kind of suggesting here, there's no explicit measure of class in the IMDb. Certainly we control for kind of related socioeconomic factors like education at landing, official language proficiency, skill level as assessed at landing. Those, I guess, would be the main ones. But I think that while, as you know, kind of entry class and birth country and gender are really the focus here, I think class is relevant in terms of how people get selected into specific entry classes. And I should note that this paper is now currently published, so it's in the journal International Migration. So I certainly encourage anyone to take a look if they're interested. And we do provide additional descriptive data in terms of really breaking down the demographic characteristics of women within these three specific entry classes. And I think some specific patterns emerge that do hint at kind of underlying class dynamics. But in addition to that, I think the key takeaway in terms of class from the paper is really how these different entry classes lead to specific classed outcomes. And here, of course, we're talking about employment income as a measure of class, which is not a perfect proxy, but certainly an important measure that gets at some of that. And we see how even when we take into account all these different measures of human capital and personal characteristics, we see these very different outcomes by entry class. And we also see relative downward mobility for women who are coming from specific countries, but also who are coming through these different entry classes. So I think class here, at least as well as we can capture it, is really focused on the ongoing effects of entry class as both a determination of kind of your initial employment, but also how your income continues over time and the ways that people get kind of stuck in low-wage jobs, which is tied to specific rules and regulations within specific entry classes, but also just in terms of how we value different types of work. So this kind of ongoing devaluation of highly feminized care work that is characteristic of people coming through the caregiver entry class. So hopefully that answers that question to some degree anyways.
Great. Thank you, Professor Littman. The next two questions queued up in the Q&A here are for Professor Brochu. The first one is, does the LFS data allow for disaggregation by census division and immigrant or visible minority status?
Okay, the first thing to note is there's a big difference on getting the data for the master files or public use files. So if you want to do disaggregated geography, it has to be with the master files. You can do it at the CMA level in the master files. In the public use files, you can do it at the provincial level or in the major cities, but that's it. With respect to the other two questions, immigrant status was introduced in the LFS as of 2006. But again, the master files will tell you exactly when you arrive, so you can do years since migration. Public use files, the best you can do is, have you been a new immigrant the last 10 years or 10 years or more? So I would argue that for immigrant-related literature, the LFS, the master files, would be, it's not as big as the census, but it's definitely underutilized when it comes to immigrants. And the last question is about visible minority status. That stuff was just introduced as of 2020. I think it's March or April 2020. And it's the same questions as the census, but that is only available in the master files. So I hope that answered your question.
Thank you, Pierre. The other question is also for you, and it has basically reads as follows. What do you have to say about the record imputation in the LFS, particularly the whole record imputation without imputation flags, and how it affects estimation of transition rates?
Okay. So the background for this is the LFS will impute missing item information. So, but the problem is that there's no flags for particular questions. All you know is whether there's a whole record imputation, whether all the labor market information was imputed. So that could occur because the person answered in the first month of the LFS, you're there for 6 months, and maybe the person could not be reached in the second month. So then they will impute the information. So the problem is it's only for all labor market information is imputed. So therefore, if you're looking at transitions, you don't know what was imputed, what was not. So was it one particular variable, or sorry, I take it back. For individual variables, you do not know, but you know for all record imputation. So what they'll use is a hot deck technique. So therefore, they'll essentially find you a donor similar to you. So therefore, it will affect the transitions. So therefore, you can use though the RC code to remove those for whom there's whole record imputation. Last thing I should mention is, for anybody 70 years and up, and you go, well, if you're looking at labor markets, should we be looking at them? But 70 years and up, they gather information the first month and then they carry it forward for all subsequent months. So therefore, what you said in the first month, if you were working, you will be classified as employed again. So if you do stuff with transitions, you have to be careful about putting a top age. Sorry, it was a bit convoluted answer. I don't know if that answered the question.
Thank you, Pierre. Naomi, here's a question. I'm going to put on my geographer's hat here for a minute. In the modeling work that you've done, time is used as a control throughout. You also allude to a spatial element, which is a control variable for the location of settlement, right, at the city level. Out of curiosity here, what's the distribution like across cities? Do you notice significant differences in terms of the incomes of the Filipino women who are working in different urban centers? They're also presumably concentrated in some of the larger urban centers?
Thanks. Yeah, I think for immigrants as a whole, right, we know they're disproportionately in major urban centers. So that's really no surprise, and specifically kind of the big cities of Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, and Calgary. And as you say, time is really our focus here, or time in the labor market. So both kind of the as a control, but also the interactive effect of time. So we can really get at those trajectories over time. So looking at relative upward or downward mobility. To be perfectly honest, we didn't really focus on geography. I think it's a really interesting question that you raise, and it would be relatively easy for us to look at. So maybe that's a great idea for kind of a future analysis, looking at whether there are different trajectories within different urban centers for specific women in different countries of origin and so on and so forth. I think for care workers in particular, it would be tied to kind of labor demand in those specific cities, which would certainly be interesting to see how those fluctuate. At the same time, I think care work in particular is one of those kind of constant demands, and we've, of course, COVID has really highlighted that for us. But certainly, you know, we know that there's always a need for people to do that kind of caregiving work, and that it's primarily immigrant and racialized women that are doing it in these cities. So all that to say, I think that's a really good question, and definitely something I'd be interested in looking into.
Great, thank you. Here's another question, which is open to both of you. Can you talk about how your experience has been working with mostly survey data to now administrative records? Which do you prefer and why? So I guess this was also addressed partly to Stephanie, but Stephanie is not here. Brian, are you involved in some of the work with Stephanie? Is that correct?
Yes, I've done quite a bit of work with Stephanie on looking at the changes in these EI programs in Canada. And in fact, before I worked with Stephanie, I worked for HRSDC on some of their earlier changes using the administrative data that they have available. And then what we did was switch over to data was in the RDC, or the Canadian RDC, to look at like LFS data and the panel data that we have that are survey data. I mean, there are benefits and disadvantages to both types of data, I think. The big disadvantage when I was working with HRSDC with their administrative data was that we couldn't publish our results until the government had decided on, you know, these pilots and what they were going to do. So there's an enormous delay between actually doing the work and getting out any sort of product for more general audiences. It was less of a problem for me because I was already a full professor, but I think when Stephanie first started, I believe she didn't have tenure yet. So, I mean, I think for young researchers, that could be quite a problem. The other drawback, at least for the data in HRSDC, was the way they were putting together these histories on EI claimants was that if you claimed once and you never came back to and it had a future claim, you were lost, so you couldn't see exactly what their job experience was. So you had this selection problem where only those who came back to the system would they then report the job they had in between their previous claim and their current claim. But if you never claimed again within the window, then you were lost. Other than that, I mean, we were able to also look, they did their own survey data that you could then merge to the claim data, which was very helpful. Now I know in the US, I work at Census RDC there, and there's a lot of bigger data sets coming online, and some people are getting access to the IRS data, as well as in Canada, there's the income tax data, which will be a lot more helpful in tracking people, especially those, for example, who leave whatever sort of safety net type of data or receipt. You know, if they leave that system, you can still see their income on the income tax data in Canada. The other drawback, though, is with some survey data, you have a lot more richer data, income data, but I think that may not be a problem to the extent if you can merge a lot of the administrative data with the survey data. So I think combining them in certain instances will lead to a richer data set than looking at one in isolation in some cases, because of the, like, you may not know in the income tax data, you wouldn't know directly, I don't think, well, at least in the US, you wouldn't, I'm not 100% sure in Canada, things like education levels, although you may be able to back it out. I don't know if you have any sort of, in the US, you can back it out through the sort of tax benefits you get for college kids if you have a dependent who's a college kid. And then so people like Carolyn Hawksby have been able to back out that data, but it's other sorts of things may be more difficult to get just directly in the administrative data. So I think there's cost and benefits of both. And I think there's this opportunity either merging several administrative data sets together, which in the US we've been trying to do. And I think Canada has advantages that in many cases you have national systems that allow you to merge for the whole of Canada, where in the States, a lot of things are more at the state level and it's more difficult to get cross-state types of data. And there's a lot of migration going on. So you have a lot of people leaving the States either after college or just migrating because they lost a job. And you may lose them with certain data. So, you know, it's an advantage to try to, you know, if there's any provincials, I think your educational systems tend to be more provincial, if I'm correct, you know, getting access across the provinces because people are moving around. They may go to school in one province and work in another.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Brian. So I know I'm keeping an eye on the clock here, and the session, I think was originally scheduled to end at 2:15, but let's take a few minutes. There are two more comments. Well, one comment, one question in the Q&A section. The first one is a comment. I think this relates to some of what Pierre was discussing earlier. The visible minority variable in the LFS is currently available in a supplement called Labor Market Impacts of COVID-19, which needs to be requested separately. So something to keep in mind there. The last question I'm seeing is from one of the RDC analysts at the Southwest Data Center, Southwest Ontario RDC. So I have interacted with many Filipina personnel support workers over the last 10 years. Have you taken into account, and this is addressed to you, I believe, Naomi, have you taken into account the very large networks of Filipina personal support workers who take on significant numbers of clients under the table? My impression is that they become discouraged by the employment conditions, and although they gain entry to the country via employment programs, they end up doing substantial under-the-table contracts, which benefits both the client and the PSWs financially.
Yeah, so that's a great point. Certainly, as the IMDb is focused on tax record data, it's only looking at taxable income. So the very substantial under the table market for care work would not be accounted for, as Pat notes. I think the importance of networks for the Filipina community is demonstrated in our results, where we see that those who come through the caregiver entry class from the Philippines consistently do better. over time than non-Filipino women. And I think this is precisely because of the networks that have developed in those communities to facilitate employment opportunities. So perhaps this effect is even underestimated, given that we're not getting that non-taxable income. I think to get at that, of course, we really need qualitative data. We need to kind of talk to these women, and some of the research that I've been doing with personal support workers in long-term care homes during the pandemic was qualitative. So that's where you can get at those kind of the other types of networks where people are getting jobs and not necessarily reporting that income. So yeah, I think that's a great point, and just kind of emphasizes that we have these administrative data, which are so good for so many ways and in so many capacities, but there's some questions that we can't really get at using that data.
Okay, thank you, Naomi. Perhaps a few seconds for a final question here. I don't see any in the Q&A section. So let me close the session by saying thank you to our presenters, Pierre, Naomi, Brian also for stepping in and answering questions for Stephanie. One note before we go, the next session for the conference is going to be tomorrow, so Tuesday afternoon. It'll be on education and social development, again from 1 p.m. to 2:15 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. For those of you who haven't registered, there's still time to do so and participate in tomorrow's sessions, and also for the next ones coming down the pipeline later this week. Thank you again to all. Stay safe. We'll see you in another session later on this week.